The room smelled like polished wood, gun oil, and old power. It was November 12th, 1967, 11:47 p.m., and Frank Lucas was absolutely certain he was about to die. The gun pressed against the back of his head wasn't shaking from fear. It was steady, eager. The man holding it was Zach Walker, 6'4", built like a wrecking ball, Bumpy Johnson's enforcer for 15 years. A man whose reputation traveled faster than his footsteps. A man who didn't argue, didn't hesitate, and didn't lose sleep over bodies. Zach had killed so many men he no longer counted them. Killing wasn't violence to him, it was routine. All he needed was one word. One quiet word from the man sitting behind the desk. Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed. He didn't even look surprised. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, fingers pressed together, elbows resting lightly, eyes calm and cold, like a chess player staring at the board 3 moves before checkmate. Bumpy Johnson didn't pray. Bumpy Johnson calculated. For 40 years, he'd ruled Harlem through storms of blood and betrayal. He'd watched men beg, cry, promise heaven, swear loyalty with tears in their eyes, right before selling him out. He had learned one unshakable truth. You never truly know a man until he believes he's about to die. "Tell me again," Bumpy said softly. Frank swallowed. That soft voice was worse than shouting. When Bumpy raised his voice, sometimes people survived. When he whispered, someone didn't. "Tell me," Bumpy repeated, "what Doc offered you." Frank could feel his heartbeat in his throat, in his ears, in his fingertips. The cold metal against his skull felt heavier with every second. He smelled the oil from the gun, heard Zach's breathing behind him, slow, patient, hungry. Frank didn't look at the weapon. In this world, fear was blood in the water. $10 million, Frank said. The words landed hard. 10 million in 1967 wasn't just money, it was escape. It was erasure. It was a new identity, a new country, a new life where no one ever said your name again. Enough to buy blocks of Manhattan, enough to disappear like a ghost. And what did he want for it? Bumpy asked. This was the part that could kill him. Frank paused, the gun pressed harder. He wanted everything, Frank said. Your roots, your suppliers, your political protection, every cop on payroll, every judge, every business clean and dirty. He exhaled once. And when you're gone, he wanted Harlem handed back to the Italians. No resistance, no noise, like the last 40 years never happened. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if Frank were describing tomorrow's weather. And what did you tell him? Zach laughed before Frank could answer. Nobody turns down 10 million, Zach said. Nobody, he's lying. Someone tipped you off about the meeting and now he's trying to save himself. Let me end this. Zach tightened his grip. Bumpy raised one finger. Zach went silent instantly. In that room, Bumpy's hand carried more power than any gun. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, eyes locking onto Frank's face. Are you here because you were caught? Bumpy asked. Because if that's the truth, say it, at least that takes courage. He glanced at his watch. You've got about 30 seconds to convince me you deserve to leave this office alive. Frank didn't look away. I came because I wanted you to hear it from me first, he said, before it came from someone else. Silence. Zach shifted, annoyed. Frank continued. 3 days ago, 2 men picked me up outside my apartment. Didn't say where we were going. I thought I was being driven to my grave. He paused. They took me to a warehouse in Hunts Point. Empty, just a table in the middle, and on that table. Frank closed his eyes for half a second. Was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Stacks of bills, perfectly aligned. The smell of ink and paper. Lights shining so bright the cash almost glowed. I counted it myself, Frank said. 10 million, he let me touch it, let me imagine what my life could be. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but he was listening. He said you were dying, Frank continued. Said the cancer had months left. Said when you're gone, Harlem turns into a battlefield, and the Italians already decided they're taking it back. Zach snorted. Frank ignored him. He told me I could be rich or buried. Said if I helped the transition, I'd live like a king. If I didn't, I'd die with the rest of your loyal men. Bumpy's voice cut in quietly. And what did you say? I told him I needed time. Zach exploded. There it is, 3 days. That means he was thinking about it. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Why did you wait? He asked. This was the real question. Frank felt something crack inside him. All the rehearsed lines died in his throat. Because I wanted to be sure, he said. Sure of what? Sure I could live with myself. The words surprised even Frank. I grew up dirt poor in North Carolina, he said. Watched my mother work herself raw for nothing. Watched my father drink himself into the ground because being powerless eats a man alive. His voice hardened. 10 million could have erased all of that, could have changed everything. He met Bumpy's eyes. I thought about it every second, I won't lie. The room stayed frozen. But then I realized something, Frank said. If I take that money, I become something I hate, a man who sells out everyone who trusted him, a man who can be bought. He shook his head slowly. I'd rather die broke than live knowing I chose money over who I am. For the first time, Zach didn't move. Bumpy stared at Frank, not searching for lies now, but measuring weight. Then something unexpected happened. Bumpy laughed. Not cruelly, not mockingly. Genuinely. Put the gun down, Zach. Zach hesitated, then obeyed. The weapon lowered. Frank's knees nearly gave out. Bumpy eased back into his chair. Wincing slightly from pain he refused to show. Sit, Bumpy said, because you just passed a test you didn't even know you were taking. Frank sat, still breathing like he'd surfaced from deep water. There was no doc, Bumpy said. Frank blinked. The man who showed you that money works for me, Bumpy continued. Warehouse cash, Italian story, all of it, a test. Frank's stomach dropped. I ran it on 11 men, Bumpy said quietly. Men I trusted, men who swore loyalty. He shook his head. Every one of them took the deal. Silence filled the room like smoke. I'm dying, Bumpy said, and I needed to know who wouldn't sell Harlem the moment I was in the ground. He looked directly at Frank. Now I know. Frank couldn't speak. You're not rich yet, Bumpy continued. You're not comfortable, you're still hungry, and hunger keeps men honest. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. This, Bumpy said, placing it on the desk, is 40 years of power. Frank stared at it. And this, Bumpy added, pulling out a small slip of paper, is how you become bigger than me. An address, a name. Bangkok. Bumpy's eyes gleamed. The game is about to change, Frank. He leaned forward. And if you're smart enough, you'll be the one who changes it. Frank Lucas stared at the paper like it might explode. An address in Bangkok. A name written neatly beneath it. Ike Atkinson. Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair, breathing carefully, managing pain like he'd done everything else in life, without complaint. That name, Bumpy said, is worth more than $10 million. Frank said nothing. He'd learned that when Bumpy spoke, you listened. Ike's a U.S. Army sergeant, Bumpy continued. Stationed in Southeast Asia. Right now he's moving heroin through military channels, small-time thinking, kilos. Bumpy's eyes sharpened. I don't want kilos, I want tons. The room felt different now. The gun was down, but the danger had multiplied. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about succession. The Italians own the heroin trade because they control the French connection, Bumpy said. Marseille labs, Corsican middlemen. By the time it hits New York, it's been cut so much it's barely worth using. He tapped the desk. But Southeast Asia, Golden Triangle, that product comes out nearly pure. You cut it 20 times and it still beats anything the Italians sell. Frank's mind started racing despite himself. Logistics, routes, margins, timing. If I do this, Frank said carefully, they'll come for me. Bumpy smiled. Of course they will. He reached into another drawer and slid out a yellow document. This, he said, is insurance. Frank opened it slowly. Names, addresses, businesses, politicians, police captains, judges. Italian operations across Harlem, mapped like a battlefield. If they move against you, Bumpy said, You burn everything, mutually assured destruction. Frank closed the folder, hands steady. There's one more problem, Bumpy said. He paused. Nicky Barnes. The name hit harder than any gun. Everyone assumed Nicky was next in line. Flashy, ruthless, groomed for years. He thinks he's entitled to what I built, Bumpy said. And worse, he's already promised the Italians he'll give Harlem back. Frank's jaw tightened. And worse than that, Frank asked. Bumpy's voice dropped. He's been talking to the feds. Frank felt cold spread through his chest. Informant, Bumpy continued. 3 years, protected, untouchable, that's why he walks around fearless. Bumpy reached into his pocket and placed a small brass key on the desk. Safe deposit box, Harlem Savings Bank, everything you'll need when he moves against you. Bumpy looked tired now, older than Frank had ever seen him. Promise me something, he said quietly. Promise me Harlem stays in Harlem hands. Frank didn't hesitate. I promise. For 8 months, nothing happened. That was the point. Frank kept driving Bumpy, kept running errands, kept collecting money like he always had. No flashy moves, no noise. But in secret, he memorized everything. Every page of Bumpy's folder, every name, every weakness. He flew to Bangkok twice. The first time he observed. Poppy fields stretching to the horizon, processing labs hidden in jungle-covered mountains, chemists testing product so pure it glowed under light. 98%. The second time, he negotiated. Frank didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't beg. He offered scale. By the time he left, Ike Atkinson understood one thing clearly. Frank Lucas wasn't a customer. He was the future. July 7, 1968. 2:17 p.m. Bumpy Johnson collapsed in a Harlem restaurant. Heart failure. The cancer had finally won. Frank got the call 15 minutes later. He sat alone afterward, silent. Then he stood up. There was no time to mourn. Power hates a vacuum. The funeral was 3 days later. Abyssinian Baptist Church. 2,000 people packed inside. Politicians, hustlers, celebrities, civil rights leaders, men who owed their careers and their lives to Bumpy Johnson. Frank arrived late. Deliberately. He walked down the aisle carrying a briefcase. The church went quiet. Nicky Barnes sat near the front, already wearing the look of a man who thought he'd won. Frank reached the open casket, looked down at the man who had tested him with $10 million. Then he opened the briefcase. One stack of cash. $10,000. He placed it beside Bumpy's hand. Another stack. Another. By the time he finished, $100,000 lay inside the casket, everything Frank had saved in 5 years. Then he turned. Some of you think you're about to divide an empire, Frank said calmly. Some of you already made deals with outsiders. His eyes locked on Nicky. You're wrong. The church stayed frozen. Harlem belongs to Harlem, Frank said. Anyone who disagrees knows where to find me. And he walked out. No applause. No arguments. Just fear. 3 weeks later, the war began. Nicky Barnes moved first. A meeting in Little Italy, neutral ground, Italian bosses listening with blank faces. Frank Lucas is nobody, Nicky said confidently. Give me 6 months. The Italians exchanged silent looks. Handle it, one of them said. Nicky smiled. But while Nicky was talking, Frank was flying. Back to Bangkok. The pipeline opened. Military cargo, coffins, equipment. Invisible. The first shipment hit Harlem quietly. Frank named it Blue Magic. Half the price. 4 times the strength. Within months, everything changed. Addicts lined up for blocks. Dealers switched sides. The Italians watched their market collapse. And they didn't know why. Nicky Barnes realized too late. Frank Lucas didn't just inherit power. He redesigned it. And the moment he did, there was no turning back. By the time anyone understood what blue magic really was, Harlem had already changed. Corners that once belonged to Italian-backed crews went quiet overnight. Dealers vanished. Prices collapsed. Addicts whispered one name like it was a prayer and a curse at the same time. Frank Lucas. But Frank didn't celebrate. He watched. He sat in dim rooms, listening to reports, studying patterns. He understood something most men never did. Power isn't loud. Power is consistent. Blue magic was never about heroin. It was about control. The Italians struck first. Not with bullets. With fear. A message went out across New York. Anyone caught selling blue magic would be cut off from every supply line east of the Mississippi. No protection, no backup, no mercy. For a week it worked. Dealers hesitated. Then Frank made his move. He cut the price again. Not by 10%. By half. Men laughed when they heard it, thought it was a rumor, thought nobody could survive that kind of loss. But Frank wasn't losing money. He was erasing competition. Every bag sold at a loss buried an Italian operation permanently. Their costs were too high, their chain too long, their greed too deep. They couldn't compete with a man who owned the source. Nicky Barnes felt Harlem slipping through his fingers. Meetings stopped returning his calls, soldiers stopped checking in, money slowed to a trickle. And worse, people stopped fearing him. So he decided to remind them. One night, 2 blue magic dealers were dragged into an alley near 125th Street. They were beaten slowly. Publicly, their bodies were left where everyone could see them. The message was clear. Frank got the news before sunrise. He didn't react. He finished his coffee. Then he picked up the phone. "Bring me everybody," he said. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse. No Italians, no outsiders. Only Harlem. Frank stood at the front, calm, precise. "Anyone who touches my people," he said, "dies." No shouting, no threats. Just certainty. I don't care if it's Nicky. I don't care if it's the Mafia. I don't care if it's God himself. Silence. Then Frank did something unexpected. He handed out envelopes. Inside cash, more than most of them had ever seen. "This," Frank said, "is what loyalty looks like." Fear shifted. Men didn't just want to work for Frank. They wanted to protect him. The Italians escalated. A shipment vanished on the docks. Then another. Drivers were followed, warehouses surveilled. The Mafia didn't know how Frank was moving product, but they knew he had to move it somehow. They were wrong. Frank wasn't moving heroin through the streets. He was moving it through institutions. Military transport, diplomatic channels, federal blind spots. By the time a shipment hit Harlem, it had already passed through hands that would never be searched. The Italians were fighting shadows. And losing. Meanwhile, law enforcement woke up. Too many overdoses. Too many arrests tied to the same product. One name started surfacing again and again. Blue magic. Inspector Richie Roberts was assigned the case. He wasn't like the others. He didn't take bribes, didn't drink on the job, didn't look away. And most importantly, he followed money. He built a small, clean unit. Men nobody trusted, men with nothing to lose. They didn't chase dealers. They chased patterns. And every pattern led back to one man who lived too quietly for someone making that much money. Frank Lucas. Frank felt the pressure building. Not panic. Pressure, like a storm you see days before it arrives. He responded the only way he knew how. By tightening control. No freelance dealers, no side hustles, no personal empires. Everyone worked for the organization. Everyone followed rules. Anyone who didn't vanished. Harlem became efficient. And efficiency attracts attention. Nicky Barnes made his final mistake at a club downtown. Drunk, loud, surrounded by people who no longer respected him. He called Frank's name out loud. Threatened him. Promised war. By morning, everyone knew. By nightfall, Nicky was arrested. Federal charges. Decades in prison. The man who thought he'd inherit Harlem was gone without Frank lifting a finger. But Frank didn't smile. He knew what this really meant. When rivals fall easily, it means the real enemy is watching quietly. Inspector Roberts' unit made its first major move. A coordinated raid. 4 locations. Seized cash, seized product, seized ledgers. But none of it pointed directly to Frank. No fingerprints. No signatures. No mistakes. Roberts stared at the evidence table and felt something he hated. Admiration. Whoever this is, he said, he's smarter than us. Frank sensed the shift. Too many close calls. Too many clean escapes. He started preparing. Not for prison. For legacy. He invested in businesses, property, banks, foundations. He wore suits that cost more than most houses. He walked into public events openly. Dared anyone to challenge him. And Harlem watched him rise. A man who once drove another man's car now stood untouchable. Or so it seemed. Because power always creates echoes. And echoes attract hunters. The storm finally broke one cold morning. Doors smashed. Sirens screamed. Frank was pulled from his home in handcuffs, calm as ever. As agents searched the house, they found it. The fur coat. The one Frank had worn to Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Custom-made, Russian sable, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Roberts looked at it and smiled. Now, he said, we've got you. Frank said nothing. But inside, he knew. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something darker. Because when kings fall, they don't fall alone. Frank Lucas sat in the interrogation room alone. No lawyer. No anger. No fear. The fluorescent light hummed overhead like a quiet countdown. For years, men had tried to imagine what this moment would look like, the moment Harlem's invisible king finally broke. But Frank didn't break. He waited. Inspector Richie Roberts entered carrying a single file. He didn't slam it down, didn't raise his voice. "You know why you're here," Roberts said. Frank met his eyes. "I know why you think I'm here." Roberts smiled slightly. Confidence, not arrogance. "That coat," Roberts said, "custom-made, imported, paid in cash. A driver's salary doesn't buy that." Frank leaned back. "A coat isn't a crime." "No," Roberts said calmly, "but it tells a story." Roberts opened the file. Photos, ledgers, surveillance reports, testimony. A web tightening slowly, carefully. "You built something impressive," Roberts said, "but nobody builds an empire alone." Frank said nothing, because this was the moment he'd prepared for. They charged him anyway. Conspiracy, trafficking, racketeering. The numbers were brutal. 70 years. Life. The headlines screamed. Harlem Kingpin, FALLS. Blue Magic Empire exposed. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Deals. Whispers. Betrayals. Men Frank had fed, protected, enriched. One by one, they folded. Names were spoken. Roots exposed. Secrets sold cheap. Frank watched the list grow and felt nothing. He had always known loyalty had a price. And prison made everyone poor. Then came the offer. A quiet meeting. No press, no records. Richie Roberts sat across from him again. "We want the entire organization," Roberts said. "Every name, every route, every corrupt official." Frank laughed softly. "You want God." Roberts leaned forward. "I want justice." Frank shook his head. "You don't even believe that." Silence. Then Roberts spoke the truth. "I want to stop this from happening again." Frank studied him carefully. This man was different. Clean. Dangerous. "How much time?" Frank asked. 5 years, Robert said, possibly less. The room felt smaller. Frank thought of Harlem, of Bumpy, of promises made in quiet rooms, and of men who had already betrayed him without hesitation. "I'll talk," Frank said. The fallout was nuclear. Hundreds of arrests. Police captains, politicians, judges. The system cracked under its own weight. And Frank Lucas became something unthinkable. A snitch. Harlem hated him for it. The streets erased his name. But the truth was uglier. Frank didn't betray Harlem. Harlem had already betrayed itself. Prison was slow. Quiet. Frank read, exercised thought. Years passed. Outside, the world changed. Heroin faded. Crack rose. Harlem burned in new ways. Frank was released early. No parade, no respect. Just silence. He returned to a neighborhood that barely recognized him. The corners were different. The players younger. The rules crueler. Frank walked the streets unnoticed. A ghost. He opened a small business. Lived simply. But old habits die slowly. He couldn't stay invisible. He tried to rebuild quietly. Small deals, small risks. But the game had changed. And he was out of time. They arrested him again. Smaller charges. Less dramatic. But final. This time there were no deals. No speeches. No legends left to protect. Frank Lucas died in 2019. 88 years old. Poor. Quiet. Almost forgotten. But power leaves shadows. And shadows leave lessons. Frank Lucas proved one thing beyond doubt. You don't have to be born into power to own it. But the price of a crown is everything. Friends, loyalty, legacy. In the end, the man who once controlled Harlem couldn't control time. And time always collects its debt. Frank Lucas was supposed to disappear. That was the deal. No interviews. No spotlight. No return to the legend. Just an old man living quietly on borrowed time. But legends don't retire. They haunt. Years after his final release, Frank sat in a modest home, watching television like any other retiree. The world outside had moved on: new drugs, new wars, new kings who would burn faster than he ever did. Then the phone rang. A journalist. Then another. Then Hollywood. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the myths. Frank understood something instantly. The streets had erased him. History had not. When American Gangster was announced, people thought Frank would protest. He didn't. He watched. Russell Crowe, Denzel Washington. Millions of dollars spent recreating a version of his life. But it wasn't his version. Some things were exaggerated. Some things softened. Some things hidden. Frank smiled through it all. Because even lies can preserve power. Old rivals reappeared in interviews. Former cops, former dealers, former enemies. Everyone wanted their version of Frank Lucas to be the truth. Some called him a genius. Some called him a rat. Some called him evil. Frank didn't correct them. He had learned long ago. Control the silence, and people will fill it for you. But not everyone stayed silent. Families of addicts spoke out. Mothers who lost sons to blue magic. Communities hollowed out by the very product that made Frank untouchable. They didn't see a king. They saw a ghost that never left. Frank heard those voices too. Late at night, when no cameras were around, when no legend could protect him. One evening, a young man approached him on the street. Didn't ask for money. Didn't ask for favors. Just one question. Was it worth it? Frank didn't answer immediately. He looked at Harlem, changed, scarred, still breathing. Then he spoke. I built something nobody thought I could. The young man waited. And he asked, Frank exhaled, and I paid for it every day after. The myth of Frank Lucas is dangerous because it's seductive. It tells you intelligence beats systems, that courage beats birthright, that one man can outsmart the world. And for a moment, it's true, but the myth never shows the cost. The empty funerals, the broken families, the quiet endings. It never shows the loneliness of winning alone. Frank Lucas didn't die powerful. He died remembered. And sometimes that's worse. Because memory doesn't forgive. It repeats. New Franks are born every generation, different names, same hunger. They study the legend. They miss the warning. Bumpy Johnson once said something Frank never forgot. Power isn't about how high you climb. It's about how much of yourself you lose getting there. Frank lost almost everything, but he left behind a story that refuses to die. A story about ambition without limits. A story about control without mercy. A story about a man who beat the system and was destroyed by the echo. In the end, Frank Lucas didn't escape history. He became a lesson inside it. And the lesson is simple. You can outsmart kings. You can break empires. You can even rewrite rules. But you can't outrun consequences. They wait, patiently, just like time,